The warm California sun was setting behind the towering buildings of Los Angeles when basketball legend Shaquille O'Neal found himself driving through the streets he once knew as a teenager. It had been years since he'd visited this particular neighborhood, where he spent some of his most formative years before becoming an NBA superstar. The familiar sights brought back a flood of memories: the old basketball court where he practiced his free throws, the corner store where he'd buy snacks after school, and most importantly, the high school where one special teacher had changed his life forever. As he waited at a red light, something caught his eye. On the corner, partially hidden behind a shopping cart filled with worn belongings, sat a figure that seemed strangely familiar. Shaq squinted through his car window, his heart suddenly skipping a beat as recognition dawned on him. Could it really be? The light turned green, but instead of driving forward, he carefully pulled over to the curb. The figure was Mrs. Thompson, his former high school math teacher, the woman who had stayed after school countless times to help him understand complex equations, who had believed in him when his grades were slipping, and who had written him a heartfelt letter of recommendation for college. But this wasn't the Mrs. Thompson he remembered. Her once pristine clothes were now weathered and dirty, her hair unkempt, and her proud posture replaced by a defeated slouch. Shaq sat in his car for a moment, his massive hands gripping the steering wheel as memories washed over him. He remembered the day Mrs. Thompson had pulled him aside after class, not to scold him about his grades like other teachers did, but to tell him she saw potential in him. "You're not just tall, Shaquille," she had said, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "You're smart too. You just need to believe it." Those words had stuck with him throughout his career, through championships and victories, through failures and comebacks. And now, seeing her like this, homeless and vulnerable, felt like a punch to the gut. Without hesitation, he stepped out of his car, his 7'1" frame drawing immediate attention from passers-by. Mrs. Thompson didn't notice him at first, her eyes fixed on a worn paperback book in her hands. As Shaq approached, he could see it was a mathematics textbook. Even in her current situation, she hadn't lost her passion for learning and teaching. The sight brought tears to his eyes. "Mrs. Thompson," his deep voice was unusually soft, almost tentative. She looked up, confusion crossing her face before her eyes widened in recognition. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of years and circumstances hanging heavy between them. "Shaquille?" Her voice cracked, a mix of joy and shame crossing her features. She tried to stand, but her legs seemed weak. Shaq quickly knelt beside her, his presence blocking the curious stares of onlookers. The story of how Mrs. Thompson ended up on the streets unfolded slowly, like a book whose pages were difficult to turn. A series of unfortunate events: her husband's death, mounting medical bills, a banking error that froze her pension, and finally, the loss of her home. She had been too proud to reach out for help, too ashamed to contact former students or colleagues. As she spoke, Shaq felt a deep responsibility settling on his shoulders. This woman had invested in him when he was just a teenage boy with dreams bigger than his already considerable size. Now it was his turn to invest in her. But he knew that simply throwing money at the problem wasn't the answer. Mrs. Thompson needed more than just financial help, she needed her dignity restored. "You taught me more than just mathematics," Shaq said, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught me about perseverance, about believing in myself. Now it's my turn to help you believe in yourself again." That evening, as the street lights flickered to life and the Los Angeles traffic hummed in the background, Shaquille O'Neal made a promise, not just to help his former teacher find a home, but to ensure she would never have to worry about ending up on the streets again. It wasn't just about repaying a debt, it was about honoring the person who had helped shape him into the man he had become. Little did either of them know that this chance encounter would spark a chain of events that would not only transform Mrs. Thompson's life but would also inspire thousands of others to look differently at the homeless people they passed on the streets every day. Because sometimes, behind those worn clothes and weathered faces are the very people who once shaped our lives, waiting for a chance to rebuild theirs. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Shaq wasn't about to leave Mrs. Thompson on the streets for another night. Using his connections, he managed to secure a comfortable hotel room for her, not as a permanent solution, but as a first step toward stability. As he helped carry her few belongings into the hotel, he couldn't help but notice how she clutched that old mathematics textbook to her chest like a precious treasure. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said softly as she sat on the edge of the hotel bed, "I still carry this book because sometimes I help other homeless people with their children's homework. Even without a classroom, I couldn't stop being a teacher." Her words hit Shaq hard, reminding him of the unwavering dedication she had shown all those years ago. That night, after ensuring Mrs. Thompson was settled, Shaq couldn't sleep. He sat in his home office, surrounded by his NBA trophies and accolades, but his mind was focused on the woman who had helped make these achievements possible. He began making calls to his financial advisor, his lawyer, and several real estate agents. But more importantly, he started reaching out to local organizations that helped homeless people rebuild their lives. The next morning, Shaq returned to the hotel with a plan. Over breakfast, he listened as Mrs. Thompson shared more details about her journey to homelessness. The story was heartbreakingly common, a series of small setbacks snowballing into an avalanche that swept away everything she had worked for. Her husband's medical bills had drained their savings, and the subsequent depression had made it difficult for her to maintain her teaching position. When the pension complications arose, she had no safety net left. "But you know what hurts the most?" she confided, stirring her coffee absently. "It's not the physical discomfort or even the hunger. It's the way people look through you, as if you're invisible. Former colleagues would walk past me on the street, and I could see the moment they chose not to recognize me." Shaq's massive hands tightened around his coffee cup. "Well, you're not invisible anymore, Mrs. Thompson. And we're going to change things, starting today." The first step was medical care. Years on the street had taken their toll, and Mrs. Thompson needed thorough health checkups. Shaq arranged for top physicians to examine her, addressing everything from dental work to chronic conditions that had gone untreated. During one of these appointments, he noticed her hands trembling as she filled out forms. "I feel like I don't deserve all this," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "There are so many others out there who need help too." Shaq knelt beside her chair, his presence both comforting and determined. "You spent your life lifting others up. Now it's time to let someone lift you. And maybe together, we can find a way to help others too." As weeks passed, Shaq's plan began taking shape. He worked with his legal team to help Mrs. Thompson navigate the bureaucratic maze that had frozen her pension. They discovered that the banking error could be reversed, but it would take time. Meanwhile, he helped her secure temporary housing, a small but comfortable apartment where she could regain her footing. But Shaq knew that simply providing material support wasn't enough. Mrs. Thompson needed to regain her sense of purpose. During one of their conversations, she mentioned how much she missed teaching, how she would sometimes dream about being back in the classroom. "You never stopped being a teacher," Shaq reminded her, thinking about the homeless children she had helped with their homework. "Maybe that's where we start rebuilding." He began making inquiries about teaching opportunities, but not in traditional schools. He remembered how Mrs. Thompson had always had a special way of reaching struggling students, those who, like himself, had needed someone to believe in them. Perhaps there was a way to combine her teaching skills with her unique understanding of homelessness. The idea came to him during a late-night phone call with one of his business partners. They had been discussing various charitable initiatives when inspiration struck. What if they could create a program that provided educational support for homeless children and adults working to rebuild their lives? And who better to help design and lead such a program than someone who understood both education and homelessness firsthand? When he presented the idea to Mrs. Thompson, her reaction was everything he had hoped for. For the first time since their reunion, he saw that familiar spark in her eyes, the same one he remembered from his high school days when she was explaining a particularly challenging math concept. We could help them with basic education, job applications, financial literacy, she said, her excitement growing. These are all skills people need to break the cycle of homelessness. As they discussed the possibilities, Shaq watched his former teacher transform before his eyes. The defeated posture began to straighten, her voice grew stronger, and her hands stopped trembling. She was no longer just receiving help, she was becoming part of the solution. The media eventually caught wind of the story, but Shaq was protective of Mrs. Thompson's privacy. He knew that their story could inspire others, but he wanted to ensure that she was ready for the attention it would bring. For now, they focused on the work ahead, taking each day as it came, celebrating small victories, and learning from setbacks. You know, Mrs. Thompson said one evening as they reviewed plans for their educational program, I used to think losing everything meant the end of my story. But sometimes, hitting bottom is just the beginning of a new chapter. Shaq smiled, remembering the countless times she had helped him find new ways to look at problems in high school. Some things, it seemed, never changed. Spring arrived in Los Angeles, bringing with it new beginnings. In a renovated community center downtown, Mrs. Thompson stood before a room of 20 people, her chalk tapping against the blackboard as she explained a basic accounting concept. The faces before her belonged to people who, like her, had experienced homelessness. Some were still living in shelters, others were just beginning to get back on their feet. But all shared a common goal, they wanted to learn. Shaq often stopped by to observe these classes, his giant frame somehow managing to slip quietly into the back of the room. He watched with pride as his former teacher worked her magic, breaking down complex concepts into simple, understandable pieces. It reminded him of how she used to explain algebra using basketball statistics, making mathematics relevant to his teenage mind. The education center, which they had named New Chapters, had started small but was growing steadily. They offered classes ranging from basic mathematics and literacy to job interview preparation and financial management. Mrs. Thompson had assembled a small team of volunteer teachers, many of them her former colleagues who had been moved by her story and wanted to help. One particular success story stood out. A young mother of two, who had been living in her car for 6 months, attended Mrs. Thompson's financial literacy classes while her children participated in the after-school program. Within 3 months, she had secured a job as a bookkeeper's assistant, using the skills she learned in class. Her children's grades had improved too, thanks to the tutoring they received. You see, Mrs. Thompson told Shaq one afternoon, her eyes bright with purpose, sometimes people just need someone to remind them of their worth, just like you did for me. Education isn't just about learning facts, it's about learning to believe in yourself again. The program's impact began to ripple through the community. Local businesses started reaching out, offering job interviews to program graduates. A nearby community college developed a partnership, providing pathways to further education. Even some of Shaq's NBA colleagues, inspired by the initiative, began exploring ways to replicate the program in other cities. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. One rainy morning, Mrs. Thompson arrived at the center to find a young man sleeping in the doorway. He was clutching a high school diploma, wrinkled but carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. His story tumbled out between shivers, a former honor student whose family had lost everything during the pandemic. He had been too ashamed to seek help, thinking his education should have somehow protected him from homelessness. That encounter led to an important addition to their program. Mrs. Thompson and Shaq realized they needed to address the stigma and shame that often prevented educated people from seeking help when they needed it. They began organizing support groups where people could share their stories without judgment, creating a community of mutual understanding and support. The media attention they had initially tried to avoid eventually became a powerful tool for change. Mrs. Thompson, now more confident in her role, agreed to share her story selectively, using it to challenge stereotypes about homelessness. She emphasized that homelessness didn't discriminate, it could happen to anyone, even a dedicated teacher with decades of experience. Shaq remembered the moment she first spoke publicly about her experience. It was at a small fundraising event for the center. Her voice had trembled at first, but grew stronger as she described her journey from teacher to homeless person and back to teacher again. "When I was on the streets," she said, "I kept teaching because it was the one thing that couldn't be taken from me. What I didn't realize was that I was also learning about resilience, about humanity, about the invisible threads that connect all of us. Now, when I stand before my students, I'm not just their teacher, I'm their classmate in the school of life." The impact of her words was profound. Donations poured in, not just money but also supplies, computers, and offers of professional services. Local real estate developers offered reduced rent apartments for program participants who were ready to transition into permanent housing. A tech company provided free coding classes, expanding the program's vocational training options. But perhaps the most meaningful development was how the center became a place of transformation for everyone involved. The lines between helper and helped began to blur. Program graduates returned as volunteers, sharing their experiences and skills. Current participants tutored each other, creating a network of mutual support that extended beyond the classroom walls. One day, as Shaq helped set up chairs for an evening class, he overheard two program participants discussing their futures. One was explaining a mathematical concept to the other, using the same patient, encouraging tone Mrs. Thompson had used with him all those years ago. The sight stopped him in his tracks. "Pretty amazing, isn't it?" Mrs. Thompson said, appearing beside him. "How teaching and learning come full circle." She had regained her old confidence now, but it was tempered with new wisdom, a deeper understanding of human struggle and resilience. "You know what's really amazing?" Shaq replied, thinking back to that fateful evening when he'd spotted her on the street. "How helping one person can end up helping hundreds." Mrs. Thompson smiled, watching as more students filed into the center. "And we're just getting started," she said, picking up her trusted mathematics textbook, the same one she had kept during her time on the streets. But now, its worn pages were joined by new workbooks, fresh with possibility, ready for the next chapter in their ongoing story of transformation and hope. As autumn painted the Los Angeles streets in golden hues, the new chapter's center was buzzing with activity. What had started as a simple act of kindness between a former student and teacher had blossomed into something neither Shaq nor Mrs. Thompson could have imagined. The local news had picked up their story, not as a fleeting feel-good piece, but as an example of sustainable community transformation. One particularly busy morning, Shaq arrived at the center to find Mrs. Thompson deep in conversation with a city council member. The politician had heard about their success rate. Over 70% of their program participants had secured stable housing and employment within 6 months. These weren't just statistics, these were real lives being rebuilt, one lesson at a time. "The thing is," Mrs. Thompson was explaining, her voice carrying the weight of experience, "homelessness isn't just about not having a roof over your head. It's about losing your place in the world. What we're doing here is helping people reclaim that place, and education is our foundation." The council member looked around the bustling center, watching as people of all ages engaged in various classes and activities. In one corner, a former program graduate was teaching basic computer skills. In another, a group was practicing interview techniques. The energy was palpable, a mixture of determination, hope, and mutual support. Shaq remembered his own journey with education, how close he had come to giving up before Mrs. Thompson intervened. Now, seeing her work her magic on a larger scale, he understood even better the power of having someone believe in you when you've stopped believing in yourself. The center's success began attracting attention from other NBA players and celebrities. But rather than bask in the spotlight, Shaq and Mrs. Thompson focused on creating a model that could be replicated in other cities. They documented their methods, their challenges, and their solutions, creating a blueprint for similar programs. One afternoon, while helping a young participant with his resume, Mrs. Thompson received an unexpected call. It was from a national education foundation, interested in studying their program as a potential model for addressing homelessness through education. The foundation was particularly intrigued by their holistic approach, combining academic education with life skills and emotional support. "You know what makes this work?" Mrs. Thompson told the foundation representatives during their visit. "We don't just teach subjects, we teach hope. Every person who walks through those doors is treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances." The impact of their work became evident in unexpected ways. Local businesses began reporting higher retention rates among employees who had graduated from their program. The community college partnership had expanded, offering scholarships to program participants. Even the city's approach to homelessness was shifting, with more emphasis on education and skill development alongside traditional support services. Shaq noticed another significant change: the way the community viewed homelessness. Through regular open houses and community events at the center, people began to understand that homelessness wasn't a defining characteristic but a temporary circumstance that could happen to anyone. One evening, after a particularly successful community dinner where program participants shared their stories, Shaq found Mrs. Thompson sitting quietly in her office, looking at old photographs. Among them was a picture from his high school days, showing him slouched in a desk that was too small for his frame, while she stood beside him, explaining a math problem. "I kept this all those years," she said softly. "Even when I was on the streets. It reminded me of who I was, a teacher who could make a difference." She paused, fighting back tears. "I never imagined that one day, my lowest point would lead to helping so many others find their way back." The center had become more than just a place of learning, it was a symbol of transformation. They had recently started a mentorship program, pairing current participants with program graduates. The results were remarkable. People who had once felt isolated and hopeless were now part of a supportive community, each success story inspiring others to persist. Their work began to influence policy discussions at the city level. The mayor's office reached out to discuss incorporating elements of their program into the city's homelessness strategy. Mrs. Thompson found herself speaking at council meetings, sharing insights gained from both her personal experience and their program success. "Education isn't just about books and certificates," she would say. "It's about restoring confidence, rebuilding self-worth, and reconnecting people with their own potential. When you're homeless, you lose more than your home, you lose your story. Education helps you write a new one." The impact on Shaq was profound as well. His regular visits to the center kept him grounded, reminding him that true success wasn't measured by championships or wealth, but by the lives you touched. He often thought about how close he had come to driving past Mrs. Thompson that fateful evening, how one moment of recognition had sparked such far-reaching change. As the center approached its first anniversary, they organized a special celebration. The event wasn't just about marking time, it was about honoring journeys. Former participants shared their stories, each one a testament to the power of education and community support. Among them was the young mother who had been their first success story, now promoted to full bookkeeper and mentoring others in the program. During the celebration, a local artist unveiled a mural on the center's wall. It showed a diverse group of people ascending a staircase made of books, each step representing a different aspect of their program: education, support, community, and hope. At the top of the stairs was an open door, symbolizing the new possibilities that education could unlock. Looking at the mural, Mrs. Thompson squeezed Shaq's hand. "Sometimes," she said, "the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of recognition." Shaq nodded, understanding that their work was far from over. This was just another chapter in an ongoing story of transformation, hope, and the enduring power of education to change lives. Winter brought crisp mornings to Los Angeles, and with them came a new wave of opportunities for the New Chapters Center. Mrs. Thompson stood at the window of her office, watching as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the now familiar sight of people lining up outside the center before classes began. But today was different, among the regular attendees were visitors from Chicago, New York, and Atlanta, all eager to learn how to replicate their program's success. Shaq had been instrumental in spreading the word through his network of NBA connections, but it was the program's documented success that really caught people's attention. The statistics spoke volumes. Over 200 people had transformed their lives through the center in just over a year. But it was the personal stories that truly moved people to action. One such story belonged to an elderly gentleman who had lost everything after a series of strokes left him unable to work. Through the center's programs, he not only regained his financial stability but also discovered a talent for teaching others. Now, he ran weekly workshops helping other seniors navigate technology and protect themselves from financial scams. You see, Mrs. Thompson explained to the visitors, our program works because we understand that education isn't just about teaching, it's about healing. When people lose their homes, they lose their sense of identity. Here, they find not just knowledge, but belonging. The visitors sat in on classes, observed support group sessions, and met with program graduates. What struck them most was the atmosphere of dignity and respect that permeated every aspect of the center. There were no handouts here, only hands up, as Mrs. Thompson liked to say. During lunch, Shaq joined the group, sharing his perspective on why the program worked so well. What Mrs. Thompson and I learned, he said, his voice carrying across the room, is that homelessness doesn't discriminate. The people who come through these doors are teachers, accountants, nurses, professionals who never thought they'd end up without a home. That's why our approach focuses on rebuilding not just skills, but self-worth. As interest in their program grew, so did the challenges. Maintaining the personal touch that made their center special while helping others replicate their success required careful balance. Mrs. Thompson spent hours on video calls with organizations across the country, sharing insights and offering guidance. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, she found Shaq sitting in the classroom where she used to teach him mathematics. He was holding a workbook, smiling at something written inside. "Look at this," he said, showing her a page where a participant had solved a complex problem. "They used the same method you taught me 20 years ago." Mrs. Thompson smiled, remembering those after-school sessions with a young Shaquille, determined to prove that athletes could excel in academics too. The center's success began attracting corporate attention. Technology companies offered to upgrade their computer lab, banks provided financial literacy workshops, and local restaurants ensured that no one attended classes on an empty stomach. But what touched Mrs. Thompson most was how former participants, now successful in their own right, kept coming back to help others. A touching moment came when a major educational publisher approached them about creating a specialized curriculum based on their program. Mrs. Thompson would lead the development team, ensuring that the materials reflected their philosophy of combining practical skills with emotional support. "We're not just teaching people to survive," she explained to the publishing team. "We're teaching them to thrive. Every lesson plan needs to address both the head and the heart." The curriculum development process brought unexpected healing. As Mrs. Thompson reviewed materials, she found herself processing her own journey from teacher to homeless person to educational pioneer. She began incorporating personal stories, not just her own, but those of countless others who had found their way back through education. One story particularly resonated: a former program participant who had been a high school teacher before a mental health crisis led to homelessness. After completing the program, she not only secured stable housing but also started a support group for educators facing similar challenges. Her story highlighted how anyone could fall into homelessness, and more importantly, how everyone deserved a chance to rebuild. As their model began taking root in other cities, Shaq and Mrs. Thompson received an invitation to speak at a national conference on innovative solutions to homelessness. Standing before an audience of policymakers, educators, and community leaders, they shared not just their success stories, but also their failures and lessons learned. "The key," Mrs. Thompson told the audience, "is understanding that homelessness is often not just about losing a home, it's about losing connection. Education rebuilds that connection, not just through knowledge, but through community. Shaq watched proudly as his former teacher commanded the room's attention, her words carrying the weight of both personal experience and professional expertise. He remembered the trembling woman he'd found on the street just over a year ago, and marveled at how helping her had created ripples that were now touching thousands of lives. Back at the center, they celebrated each new milestone, the opening of similar programs in other cities, the publication of their curriculum, the growing number of success stories. But they never lost sight of their core mission, helping one person at a time rebuild their life through education. One morning, Mrs. Thompson arrived to find a bouquet of flowers on her desk. The card read, "Thank you for teaching me that rock bottom can be a foundation to build upon." It was signed by one of their first participants, now running a successful small business and mentoring others in the program. Looking at the flowers, Mrs. Thompson reflected on how far they'd come from that evening when Shaq had recognized her on the street. What could have been just another sad story of a teacher falling through society's cracks had instead become a beacon of hope for others facing similar challenges. "You know what makes me proudest?" she told Shaq later that day. "It's not the awards or the recognition. It's seeing people walk out of here standing taller, knowing they have the tools to rebuild their lives. That's what education is all about, giving people back their power to write their own stories." Spring was in full bloom when Mrs. Thompson received news that would take their initiative to an unexpected level. The Department of Education had taken notice of their program success and wanted to explore implementing elements of their model in adult education programs nationwide. As she shared the news with Shaq, both of them reflected on how far they'd come from that life-changing encounter on the streets of Los Angeles. "Remember when you used to struggle with probability in high school?" Mrs. Thompson asked Shaq with a gentle smile. "What would you say the odds were of our story turning out like this?" Shaq laughed, his deep voice echoing through the center's hallway. "You always taught me that numbers don't tell the whole story. Some things can't be calculated, like the impact of showing kindness at the right moment." The center had become a hub of innovation in addressing homelessness through education. Researchers from major universities were conducting studies on their methods, documenting the unique combination of academic education, life skills training, and emotional support that made their program so effective. One afternoon, while reviewing data with the researchers, they discovered something remarkable. The program wasn't just helping people find homes and jobs, it was breaking generational cycles of poverty. Children of participants were showing improved academic performance, and families were staying together, stronger than before. A touching example of this impact came from a family that had been living in their car when they first found the center. The mother attended financial literacy classes while her teenage children received tutoring. Now, 6 months later, the mother was working as an administrative assistant, and her oldest daughter had received a college scholarship. "The real power of education," Mrs. Thompson explained during a panel discussion, "is that it doesn't just change one life, it changes families, communities, and generations to come." Their success attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Tech industry leaders began exploring ways to support the program through technology education initiatives. One company offered to develop a free online learning platform that would make their curriculum accessible to people in rural areas who couldn't reach physical centers. Shaq took particular interest in this digital expansion. He remembered how Mrs. Thompson had always emphasized the importance of adapting teaching methods to reach different types of learners. Now, technology could help them reach people they never thought possible. However, with growth came new challenges. Mrs. Thompson was adamant about maintaining the personal touch that made their program special. "Technology is a tool," she insisted during planning meetings, "but it can't replace human connection. We need to find ways to build community, even in a digital space." Their solution was innovative. They created virtual support groups and mentoring programs, connecting participants across the country. Someone in rural Montana could now learn from and be inspired by a program graduate in Los Angeles. The online platform became not just a place for learning, but a community of hope and mutual support. One of their most successful initiatives was the Stories of Renewal project, where program graduates shared their journeys through video diaries. These raw, honest accounts of falling into homelessness and finding their way back through education became powerful tools for breaking down stigma and inspiring others. A particularly moving story came from a former executive who had lost everything during a health crisis. Through the program, she not only rebuilt her life but discovered a passion for teaching others about financial resilience. Her story resonated with many who had believed homelessness could never happen to them. The impact on Shaq himself was profound. His involvement with the center had changed how he viewed his own success. "Basketball gave me a platform," he told a group of young participants, "but what matters most is how you use that platform to lift others up." Mrs. Thompson's role had evolved too. From a teacher who had lost everything, she had become a leading voice in educational innovation. Yet she never lost the humility that made her such an effective teacher. She still taught classes regularly, believing that staying connected to individual students kept her focused on what really mattered. One day, while helping a participant prepare for a job interview, she received an unexpected visit from a former student, not Shaq, but someone who had been in her high school class years ago. He had recognized her from a news feature about the center. "You were always more than just a math teacher," he told her, emotion thick in his voice. "You taught us to believe in ourselves. When I heard what happened to you, and then how you turned it into something so powerful, it reminded me that our worst moments don't define us." The center's approach to education continued to evolve based on participant feedback and needs. They introduced new programs focusing on entrepreneurship, digital literacy, and creative arts. Each edition was carefully designed to build not just skills, but confidence and community. Their work began influencing how cities approached homelessness prevention. Rather than waiting for people to lose their homes, communities started implementing early intervention programs based on their model. Education and skill building became key components of homelessness prevention strategies nationwide. During a quiet moment between classes, Shaq found Mrs. Thompson sitting in her favorite spot by the window, watching people enter the center. "You know what I see when I watch them come in?" she asked. "I see myself as I was, but I also see what they can become. Every person who walks through that door is carrying a story that's not finished yet." The truth of her words was evident in the transformation they witnessed daily. People who arrived carrying the weight of shame and defeat gradually straightened their shoulders, lifted their heads, and began to dream again. Education wasn't just giving them knowledge, it was restoring their sense of possibility. As their sixth successful center prepared to open in another city, Shaq and Mrs. Thompson sat together, looking at photos from their journey. "Sometimes the best teaching happens outside the classroom," she mused, touching a picture of their first group of graduates. "Sometimes it happens when we simply refuse to look away from someone in need." Shaq nodded, thinking about that fateful evening when he had almost driven past. "And sometimes," he added, "the greatest lessons come from the teachers we thought we'd finished learning from." As summer approached, the new chapter's center was preparing for its biggest challenge yet, hosting the first national conference on educational solutions to homelessness. Representatives from over 50 cities would be attending, eager to learn from their success. But on the morning of the conference, Mrs. Thompson's attention was focused on a single individual. A young man stood in her office, clutching a worn backpack. He had been living in his car for 3 months after losing his job as a software developer. What struck Mrs. Thompson wasn't just his story, but the familiar look in his eyes, the same one she had seen in her own reflection during her time on the streets. "You know," she told him, "the day Shaquille found me, I was reading a math textbook. Even at my lowest point, I held on to what I knew, that knowledge and education could never be taken away from me." The young man's eyes brightened slightly. "I still have my laptop," he admitted. "Sometimes I sit in coffee shops, practicing coding. It helps me feel normal." This conversation would later become a turning point in their program's evolution. During the conference, Mrs. Thompson shared this encounter, highlighting how many homeless individuals retained valuable skills and knowledge. They just needed a bridge back to stability. Shaq, who had been quietly observing the conference proceedings, stepped forward to announce a new initiative. They would partner with tech companies to create a program specifically for displaced tech workers, allowing them to maintain and update their skills while rebuilding their lives. "Sometimes," he told the audience, "we forget that homelessness doesn't erase who you are or what you know. Our job is to help people reconnect with their capabilities and build from there." The conference became a catalyst for innovation. Other centers shared their experiences, challenges, and solutions. A center in Chicago had success with a mobile classroom that brought education to homeless encampments. Another in Seattle had developed a promising partnership with local libraries. But it was the personal stories that truly captured everyone's attention. A woman who had completed their program 6 months ago took the stage to share her journey. Once a high school counselor, she had lost everything during a long battle with depression. Through the center, she not only found stability but also discovered a new purpose, helping others navigate the emotional trauma of homelessness. "The biggest lesson I learned," she told the hushed audience, "was that rock bottom has a basement. But education gives you the tools to build stairs back up." Her words resonated deeply with Mrs. Thompson, who remembered her own journey. During a break in the conference, she found herself walking through the center's halls, now adorned with success stories and artwork created by participants. Each piece told a story of resilience and renewal. One particular art installation caught everyone's attention, a wall of keys, each representing a participant who had moved into stable housing. But these weren't just any keys, they were artistic representations created in the center's workshops, each one decorated to tell its owner's story. "Every key represents a door opening," Mrs. Thompson explained to visitors. "Not just to a home, but to a new chapter in life." The conference also brought unexpected opportunities. A major foundation proposed funding research into the long-term impact of their educational approach to homelessness. Universities wanted to develop courses based on their methodology. But what excited Mrs. Thompson most was the interest from public school systems in implementing preventive programs. "If we can teach financial literacy, job skills, and resilience before people face crisis," she explained to Shaq, "imagine how many we could help before they ever reach the streets." Shaq nodded, remembering his own youth and how close he had come to giving up on education. "It's like what you taught me about momentum in physics," he said. "Sometimes a small push in the right direction can change everything." The conference's impact rippled outward in unexpected ways. Local businesses began offering apprenticeships to program participants. Community colleges developed flexible schedules and support services for students experiencing housing insecurity. Even city planning departments started consulting with them about integrating educational facilities into homeless services. One afternoon, while reviewing plans for their next center, Mrs. Thompson received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from a former student who had seen her story on the news. He wrote about how her teaching had kept him in school 20 years ago, and now he wanted to volunteer as a tutor. "Your story taught me that we're all just one circumstance away from needing help," he wrote. "But we're also one person away from finding hope." The letter sparked a new initiative, reaching out to former educators who had experienced homelessness. Their insights and experiences would prove invaluable in refining their teaching methods and understanding the unique challenges faced by professionals who suddenly found themselves without homes. As the conference drew to a close, Shaq and Mrs. Thompson sat together in the empty auditorium, reflecting on their journey. The center had grown far beyond their initial vision, yet its heart remained the same, the belief that education could transform lives. "You know what I've learned?" Mrs. Thompson said softly. "That teaching isn't just about passing on knowledge. It's about bearing witness to someone's potential, even when they can't see it themselves." Shaq smiled, remembering the countless times she had done exactly that for him. And sometimes, he added, the greatest learning happens when we think we're the ones doing the teaching. The next morning, as new participants arrived for classes, Mrs. Thompson stood at the door, greeting each one by name. Among them was the software developer from the conference's opening day, now enrolled in their tech retraining program. His eyes were clearer now, carrying a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. "Ready to start your new chapter?" she asked him. He nodded, clutching his laptop like a lifeline. "You know," he said, "for the first time in months, I actually believe there can be one." And that, Mrs. Thompson thought, watching him walk into the classroom, was what their work was really about, not just teaching skills or providing resources, but rekindling belief in the possibility of a better tomorrow. 2 years had passed since that fateful evening when Shaquille O'Neal spotted his former teacher on the streets of Los Angeles. Now, on a warm autumn morning, Mrs. Thompson stood before a crowd gathered for the groundbreaking ceremony of their 10th, New Chapters, Center. The location held special significance. It was just blocks away from where Shaq had first recognized her. "Life has a way of bringing us full circle," she began, her voice steady and strong. "2 years ago, I was standing on these streets with nothing but a mathematics textbook and lost hope. Today, we stand here together, building not just a center, but a beacon of hope for others who might be where I once was." The crowd included familiar faces from their journey, program graduates, dedicated volunteers, corporate partners, and city officials. But most meaningful were the current program participants, sitting in the front rows, their presence a testament to the ongoing need for their work. Shaq watched from the side, his heart full as he remembered the trembling woman he'd found that evening. The transformation wasn't just in her circumstances, it was in her spirit. She had taken her darkest moment and turned it into light for others. After the ceremony, they walked through the construction site together. The new facility would be their largest yet, featuring state-of-the-art classrooms, a technology center, counseling spaces, and something new, a research wing dedicated to studying and improving their educational approach to addressing homelessness. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Mrs. Thompson said, pausing to look at the foundation being laid. "All those evenings I spent helping you with mathematics after school. How you'd say, 'But when will I ever use this in real life?'" She smiled. "Who knew we'd be using those problem-solving skills to help rebuild lives?" Shaq laughed, remembering those afternoons. "You always said mathematics was about more than numbers, it was about finding patterns, solving problems, seeing possibilities where others saw dead ends." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a news crew for a scheduled interview. The reporter asked about their latest statistics. Over 2,000 people helped across their centers, an 80% success rate in achieving stable housing and employment, and numerous cities adopting their model. But Mrs. Thompson gently steered the conversation away from numbers. "The real story," she said, "isn't in the statistics. It's in the single mother who just got her first promotion. It's in the veteran who's now teaching others. It's in the retired accountant who lost everything and is now helping others manage their finances." The reporter then asked about their newest initiative, a scholarship program for the children of participants. Shaq stepped forward to explain how they'd noticed that stable housing and education for parents had a profound impact on their children's academic performance. "We're not just changing individual lives," he explained. "We're changing family trees. When kids see their parents return to education, it transforms their own relationship with learning." Later that afternoon, they hosted a small gathering for program graduates who had become staff members at various centers. Among them was the software developer who had arrived clutching his laptop 2 years ago. He now ran their technology training program, helping others maintain and upgrade their skills during housing transitions. "The most important thing I learned here," he told the group, "wasn't coding or job skills. It was that our worst moments don't define us, they refine us." Mrs. Thompson looked around the room at all the faces she'd come to know, each one carrying a story of fall and rise, of loss and renewal. She remembered the shame she'd felt when Shaq first found her, how she'd tried to hide her face. Now, these stories were shared openly, each one helping to break down the stigma of homelessness. The day's events concluded with a tradition that had become central to their program, the full circle ceremony. New participants sat with program graduates, sharing fears and hopes, questions and wisdom. The power of these connections never failed to move both Shaq and Mrs. Thompson, watching as people who had lost everything found new purpose in helping others. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the construction site of their new center, Shaq and Mrs. Thompson took one last walk through the area. They passed the street corner where their reunion had occurred, now marked with a small plaque that read, "Where recognition became revolution." "You know what amazes me most?" Mrs. Thompson said, touching the plaque gently. "How one moment of kindness can multiply. Every person we help becomes a helper. Every story of renewal becomes inspiration for someone else's beginning." Shaq nodded, thinking about the ripple effects of that single decision to stop his car that evening. "You taught me more than mathematics," he said. "You taught me that education is about seeing potential in people, even when they can't see it in themselves." A group of current participants was leaving the day's classes, and Mrs. Thompson watched them walk past. She could see in their faces the same determination she had felt when she first walked into their original center, the mix of hope and fear, of uncertainty and possibility. "We're not just teaching them to survive," she said softly. "We're teaching them to thrive. And in doing so, we all learn that our stories aren't over until we say they are." As they prepared to leave, a young woman approached them. She was clutching a familiar-looking mathematics textbook, the same edition Mrs. Thompson had held during her time on the streets. "I found this in a donation box," she said. "The notes in the margins, they're yours, aren't they?" Mrs. Thompson took the book with trembling hands. There, in her own handwriting, were the annotations she had made during her darkest days, problems solved, concepts explained, hope maintained through the simple certainty of mathematics. "Keep it," she told the young woman. "And remember, knowledge is the one thing that can never be taken from you. It's not just about the mathematics, it's about knowing that no matter where you are, you have something valuable to offer the world." As they watched the young woman walk away, book clutched to her chest, Shaq and Mrs. Thompson stood in comfortable silence. Their work was far from over, there were more centers to build, more lives to touch, more stories to be transformed. But in that moment, they could see how far they'd come from that chance encounter on a Los Angeles street. "Ready for our next chapter?" Shaq asked with a smile. Mrs. Thompson looked at the construction site, then back at the street corner where their story had begun. "You know what I've learned," she said. "Every chapter is both an ending and a beginning. And the best stories are the ones we write together."